Now, the former U.S. President George Bush Sr. has made serious allegations about the role played by key figures in his son's administration following the September 11th attacks. In a biography to be released next week, Bush Sr. takes swipes at his son's Vice President Dick Cheney and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, suggesting they had too much influence on decisions to go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's been reported that Bush Sr. accuses Cheney of effectively circumventing the presidency by creating a national security team under the control of the Vice President's office. In the biography, Bush Sr. also accuses former Secretary of State of Defense, Rumsfeld, of arrogance and of hurting the credibility of President George W. Bush. Bush Sr. specifically cited George W.'s 2002 speech linking U.S. enemies Iraq, Iran, and North Korea.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
Well, Lawrence Korb was a former Assistant Secretary of Defense for George Bush Sr. He's now Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress and joins me now from Washington, D.C. Thank you for speaking to us. You know, there's always been this speculation about what might have gone on behind closed doors, what George Bush Sr. might have said to his son in terms of his son's response to the 9/11 attacks. What are your thoughts now on this very public criticism of Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld?
Well, there's never been any doubt that the elder Bush did not think we should go into Iraq, but obviously he didn't want to tell his son directly. In fact, in the book, he basically says, you know, he made his own decisions because Brent Scowcroft, who was the Bush Sr.'s national security advisor, wrote an op-ed, an editorial in the Wall Street Journal about 6 months before the war saying it was a big mistake. And the fact is he wouldn't have done that without checking with the elder. And I think that the elder Bush had recommended Cheney as vice president because he was very happy with him when he was his Secretary of Defense. But then he saw the way that he was acting. I think he believed quite correctly he had too much influence on his son. And of course, Rumsfeld, who he had worked with going back to the administration of Richard Nixon, he never did think much of him, basically thought he was just, I won't even use the term he used in the book, but just too hard over on the issues about using force.
Do you think, do you think that Bush Sr. perhaps has some regrets in terms of not being as vocal as he could have been in the use of force, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that followed the 9/11 attacks?
Well, I think not Afghanistan, but particularly Iraq, I think he would have. Obviously, he's disappointed because, remember, after the first Gulf War, people said, well, why don't you go and get rid of Saddam? And he basically said, what will we do when we get to Baghdad? Well, that's something his son didn't really think about either and had to live with the consequences. So I think he's trying to set the historical record here that we all knew it, but I think he's finally come out and said it. Now, he's not going to blame his son directly, but I think what he's saying is he got bad advice from the people around him.
And of course, we see the consequences of those two wars playing out right now. And it looks as though that they will continue beyond Obama's presidency. And when you look at what has been said here by Bush Sr., he accuses Cheney of empowering his own team at the expense of the presidency. And he describes Rumsfeld as being arrogant and as being a figure that hurt the credibility of the presidency. What are the implications here, perhaps, for when it comes to the power of the executive and the team surrounding the president when it comes to making such crucial foreign policy decisions that this was able to happen?
Well, I think the lesson is do not elect a president who does not understand the world and foreign policy, because the second President Bush came in. He had no foreign policy background. You know, he wouldn't even know Germany was in NATO. He didn't know Pakistan was run by a military general. And so when you put people around him who were as arrogant and forceful and as, dynamic, if you will, as Cheney and Rumsfeld, it was easy for them to sway him using 9/11 to do what they really wanted to do all along, which was to get rid of Saddam Hussein.
How potentially harmful is that to be so open about the fact, I suppose, confirming what many people already thought or knew or suspected, but to be so open about the fact that effectively the most powerful man in the world can be manipulated in this way if these accusations are to be believed?
And I intend to be the next president of the United States.
Yeah, I think it says we have to be very careful about who we put in office. And of course, we have an election coming up now, and you have a lot of candidates who don't seem to have very much experience, because if you don't, then you can be taken in by the people around you who have much more experience. Remember, Cheney and Rumsfeld have been basically in Washington since the administration of Richard Nixon, working on foreign policy issues, so they had much more background. I think toward the end of his presidency, the younger Bush did realize that. He actually did fire Rumsfeld and stop paying attention to Cheney, but by then it was too late.
It sounds like a fascinating book. Lawrence Korb, very good to get your thoughts on it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.